Welcome. I'm Dr. Lisa Toppin, and I'm excited to welcome you to this episode of Inputs to Action. Today, my guest is Barbara Harrison, and I've got to give you the full context of Barbara Harrison so you can appreciate the conversation that we're going to have today, because it's an important conversation. And so Barbara Harrison is a certified genetic counselor. She is an assistant professor, Department of Pediatrics and Child Health, and assistant director, Community Outreach and Education, Center for Sickle Cell Disease at Howard University College of Medicine. Barbara, welcome.
Thank you. I'm very happy to be here and happy to join.
Excited to have you, and I'm excited. It came to me that we are in Sickle Cell Awareness Month, and was important. And it came back to me that it is so important to really talk about. And I was delighted to learn of your depth and expertise in this field. So I'm hoping you're just going to take us in and get us as my friends say, gather us up, get us together around around sickle cell and what it's all about. So the first piece that I really would love to understand is how did you land on this as a field of study? You're doing so many things in the field. How did you get here?
Yeah. Well, I'm definitely one who feels your steps are ordered and things are going on around you that you don't really know how they're going to fit together, till you get there. So, in my family, I have two cousins who have sickle cell disease, and they've passed on now. One passed away when I was younger, and one has passed away since I've been an adult, her sister. Mm-hmm. And so, I kind of seen that family, kind of that nuclear family, see how it affected my aunt and uncle and, the children. And so as a child, I thought about that. And I had an interest in biology, knew I had an interest in health, developed an interest in genetics. And I didn't really know how that sickle cell piece was affecting me at the moment. But anyways, definitely had an interest in genetics. So I went to undergrad, studied biology, got into genetics. Wasn't quite sure what I wanted to do. I wanted to be in healthcare, and really all I knew about was being a doctor or being a nurse. Neither of which was necessarily appealing to me for various reasons. The hours, the life and death, decisions, like that just is not my style. So I decided I would just go to more school until I figured it out. So I went to get a PhD. I said, I'm going to go get a PhD. So I was actually talking to programs or departments about PhD, pursuing that and what their programs were offering. And I went to one department at a university, and he asked me what did I want to do my research on. And of course, they're very lab-oriented research. And I said, well, I really would like to talk to patients if I could. And I have this interest in sickle cell and, really kind of see what patients are going through. And he kind of looked at me weird, because that's not usually what he hears from people who want to get a PhD. Right. And he asked me if I'd ever heard of genetic counseling. And this was me, going into my senior year in college. And I was like, no, I've never heard of it. And he had a counselor who was working with him on a research project. And so I went and talked to her, and this was, a little back in the day. So from there, I had to make some phone calls and write some letters and get some information mailed to me about genetic counseling, and loved it. And it's amazing. My college roommate, I actually wrote her a letter that summer. And it was like a 4-page letter, but 2 pages of it was about how I had found this field of genetic counseling. And I think this is it for me. And I was so excited. And it's just really amazing looking back on it now. Yeah. But anyway, so I went to pursue my genetic counseling degree. It's a master's degree, 2-year program. I went to Pittsburgh. And that's really how I got into genetic counseling. Okay. And it just really was a good match. It allowed me to be in healthcare, allowed me to be in a place where I felt like I was helping people. I'm talking to people, similar to how you do in your blog, taking that complex information, making it simple or at least digestible in a way that allows people to make decisions about their health. And so it really has been a great fit. And when I landed at Howard, which was really a dream place of mine, to be able to come back to the community and really do this work, they had a center for sickle cell disease. And again, things just came full circle. So I was able to, kind of develop not only my expertise in genetic counseling in general, but then, even pursue this interest in sickle cell.
Well, it's just it's a great story, and I know about that kind of excitement when you find your thing, because
Mm-hmm.
I sort of have a similar story.
Okay.
We'll
Oh, we have to share
have
that.
to chat about that at another time. But I know how that 4-page letter felt, because I
Yes.
probably had one similar. Um, so here's the thing, with sickle cell. Like, I remember hearing about it in my youth.
Mm-hmm.
And I can't really even place it. I don't know if we were in high school, if it was, during undergrad years at Howard, but I remember learning about sickle cell and sort of appreciating this whole idea of whether or not you have the disease or whether or not you have the trait, and how you've got to really explore this before you decide to have children. So, my question really is, many people don't even understand what it is.
Yeah.
So maybe let's start there. Like, maybe give
Okay.
us the primer on what is sickle cell disease.
Yeah.
And
Absolutely.
from what I understand, it's been around for a really long time. One of the
Mm-hmm.
earlier genetically identified
Yep.
diseases. So
Yeah. Yeah.
take us in on sickle cell.
Yeah, well, I can definitely take you a little bit on that history train and kind of where we are now. So, sickle cell disease is a genetic condition. And so, it's a condition that affects the red blood cells. It causes those cells to become misshapen. It's caused by a problem with what we call hemoglobin. So, hemoglobin is just a protein that's inside the red blood cell, it carries oxygen. And red blood cells are usually very kind of mushy. I often describe it as a bean bag. So, if you think of the bag as the cell and the beans inside are the hemoglobin. And so it goes about its merry way and does its job. But there are different types of hemoglobin. And so make an analogy to things like eye color, hair color. There's different types of eye colors, different types of hair color, different hair textures, right? All that is what we call genetic variation.
Mm-hmm.
And so, similarly with hemoglobin, there's different types or variants of hemoglobin. So, the most common type of hemoglobin is called hemoglobin A. That's the most type most people have. It carries oxygen as it's supposed to. But hemoglobin S is the next most common type of hemoglobin, and it's what we call sickle hemoglobin. And so, this variation of hemoglobin also carries oxygen as it's supposed to. But when it loses its oxygen, so all hemoglobin, when it gets to the muscles and the bones, it's going to drop that oxygen off, exchange it with carbon dioxide, right?
Okay.
But when it drops that oxygen off, that hemoglobin S becomes sticky, and it actually starts to physically stick to other pieces of hemoglobin in that cell. So that now, instead of having a bean bag, now you're starting to get a bag of sticks, because those pieces of hemoglobin are literally stacking on top of each other and making these long rods inside. We call it, they're aggregating.
Okay.
And so that causes this cell to take this very abnormal shape. Now, when that occurs, it causes the cell to become rigid, and that cell can't move and it's not as flexible. It can't get through the blood vessels like we expect it to. And so that causes pretty much like mini clots in the very, very small blood vessels. And when that occurs, now you're disrupting blood flow. So now you're not getting water, nutrients, blood, oxygen, anything to what's on the other side. And so that bone, tissue, organ is going to let the brain know that. And one of the main ways it does that is pain. So people with sickle cell disease almost constantly are living with a level of pain.
Wow.
And so many just learn to kind of, move on anyway. But there are times when that pain spikes, and we call that a crisis. Or a pain episode. And so that can require more immediate care, visit to the ER, et cetera. Now a little bit of history. So we identified that this disease, back in the homeland back in Ghana, Liberia, there are historical descriptions of disease that we think was sickle cell disease.
Ah,
Um, and then here in the States around 1910, there was the first description of sickle cell disease. Someone actually saw those red blood cells looking different under a microscope.
wow.
So that was back in 1910. In 1950, 49, 50, we identified the actual problem with that hemoglobin molecule that caused sickle cell. But it wasn't, but all this time, there's really no difference in treatment. No one's really paying attention to sickle cell. It does happen more often in individuals from the African diaspora here in the United States, and I'll come back to that. But anyway, so it's not getting a lot of attention. It's not until I have to give a lot of credit wherever I have this platform to give credit to the Black Panthers.
Mm.
Panthers were critical in raising the awareness in our Black community about sickle cell disease. Now we know they were very active in fighting police brutality and injustices in housing and so forth, but they also had a very strong health agenda. They opened free clinics, and they did a lot of screening about sickle cell disease and sickle cell trait back in the very late 60s into 70.
Wow.
That might have been where you had a little spike of people talking about it quite a bit during that time. In 1970, because of pressure from the Black Panther Party, as well as many Black physicians, kind of raising is like, this is a public health issue. This disease has been ignored all this time. So President Nixon in 1970 signed the National Sickle Cell Control Act. And that actually gave a lot of money into sickle cell and sickle cell research. And it had its, its negatives as well. As far as there was some misinformation that was going around, President Nixon said that this disease only strikes Blacks and no one else, and that's not true. So there were some things, that weren't perfect about it, but it did give a lot of money and established a lot of comprehensive sickle cell clinics around the country. Okay. Now, unfortunately, and this could be another discussion, that funding is not the same as it was. Sickle cell still doesn't deserve or get what it deserves as far as funding and research attention. Something that's kind of starting to change now, but only after people have made a lot of noise about it. But anyways, back to that historical piece. So it kind of spiked. And the last point about it being mostly in people of African descent. Mm-hmm. So I mentioned the types of hemoglobin. Right. Now, from a genetic standpoint, you get half of your genetic information from mom, half from dad, or half, from the egg and the sperm. So everyone actually has two hemoglobin genes. If you get two genes that tell you to make hemoglobin A, then you just make your hemoglobin A. If you got from both parents that gene for hemoglobin S, then you have sickle cell disease. Right. And then there's other variations that can also lead to sickle cell disease. But if you inherit an A from one parent and then hemoglobin S from another parent, from your other parent, then you now have what we call sickle cell trait. Mm-hmm. And if literally we look in your red blood cells, about half of your hemoglobin is A and about half is S. You make a little more A than S, your body kind of figures out that it works better. Mm-hmm. So that most people with sickle cell trait don't have any major complications.
I never understood this. Okay.
Because they have that hemoglobin A, and it usually breaks down to like a 70-30, usually. Mm-hmm. But if you have sickle cell trait, you actually are protected against malaria. Mm-hmm. So the sickle cell hemoglobin really evolved as a protection against malaria. And so if you think about areas like Africa, Italy, India, right, Saudi Arabia, places where there's where malaria is prevalent, people who have sickle cell trait, and there's other types of hemoglobin variants as well that you may see in different countries, but they had this protection so that if malaria came to the village, the folks with sickle cell trait would survive. I see. Those with sickle cell disease were probably having a hard time anyway and didn't make it. Right. Right. And those with, AA had malaria and didn't make it. And so that's what really perpetuated and kept this sickle cell gene in the gene pool.
I see.
Here comes the transatlantic slave trade.
Ah,
slaves are kidnapped, brought over to the States. That's what really, there was a major reason why the gene is in the United States. And so that's why the majority of people you see in the States have African descent. But as we were talking a little bit before, genes don't know color. So
right,
where those genes are going, where them eggs and sperm are going, that's where that gene's going.
right,
So
right,
as we have these mixed relationships and so forth, you will see people of all kinds of hues that can
right,
have sickle cell. You know,
right,
that gene doesn't follow the black skin gene, right?
right,
It's we know that race doesn't have a biological construct anyway,
right.
but there is not a biological construct. But anyway, so yeah, but that's why you see that here in the States. But if you look, across worldwide, you see it in all, see it in many different ethnicities.
Right,
Um,
right.
you
Wow.
know,
That's such a good, that's a great history lesson actually,
yeah.
because I did not I had heard of the connection between malaria, but I
Hmm.
didn't fully understand it. So I love how you broke that down, and sort of connecting the historical, I'm going to say, move of people and how that
Yes.
really influences why we see what we see today. So that important to understand. And I think for all of us now, as you mentioned, the idea that we everybody's loving who they want to love, right? Making babies
Right.
with who they want to make babies, and
Right.
so that too becomes a variable that will change, or I'm sure is changing
Yes.
the conversation,
Yeah.
and in
Yeah.
some respects. But again, an important conversation to have. Okay, so we've got the breakdown. We're anchored in history. We understand how we got there. Listen, you're from the College of Medicine. We're going along on a little curriculum here. Okay, so we talked about the concentration in the African American community, because I think that
Right.
was also one of my questions, and an important one. So here's
Yes.
the thing. So and you kind of alluded to this: less research, long standing, understood, less research. So where are we on
Yep.
here? I thought I had read or heard something not too long ago about someone getting a cure, so to speak, out in
Hmm.
NIH. But where
Hmm.
is that true? Are we
Hmm.
heading for a
Hmm.
cure? Where are we?
Yeah, so let me get to the second question first about the cure, and then I'm gonna go back and just say a word about research again, whatever, about this platform with some things I gotta
Yeah,
say.
that's
All right,
great.
so as far as the cure, um, so we are working our way there. There are different treatments for sickle cell. So you have treatments for the pain, which
Hmm.
usually aren't that great, and then you have treatments just for the disease itself and trying to make the disease process lessened. And then you have bone marrow transplant. So bone marrow transplant is important for sickle cell disease because your bone marrow is what makes your red blood cells.
Okay.
And so if you can change a person's bone marrow and change the genetics in that bone marrow, get a transplant and get, bone marrow that does not make um, sickle
S.
cell disease,
Mhm.
make hemoglobin S, then you can, that person will start making hemoglobin A, and then that won't happen. So there are efforts around bone marrow transplant. Many of those efforts are still in clinical trial, but generally available.
Okay.
Kind of your bigger academic institutions where you can find ideally a sibling
Hmm.
who can donate their bone marrow to you. Now, the trick is that from a genetic standpoint, you want your bone marrow donor to be very close to you in a certain way from a genetic standpoint,
Okay.
right? Because you don't want your body, if you are the person getting the bone marrow, you don't want your body to fight this
Right.
bone marrow transplant because your body thinks it's an enemy, right? Doesn't
Right. Right.
find it
Doesn't
familiar.
recognize it. Yeah.
So there are certain, what we know, these genetic markers that are particularly important in how your body recognizes a foreign entity versus yours.
Mm-hmm.
And so if you have a sibling, a full sibling in particular, you will share many of those genetic markers because you came from the same
Parents.
parents. So So if you have a full sibling, this might be something that's an option.
Okay.
However, that full sibling has to be healthy. That full
Hmm.
sibling cannot have sickle cell trait. And so
Hmm.
if you have sickle cell disease, then it's, you're every time that couple that has both people have sickle cell trait, it's a 25% chance their child will have sickle cell disease and a 50% chance their child will have sickle cell trait. So
Right.
there's a good chance that your sibling has trait and it wouldn't be
Right.
a
They can't help
optimal
you. Right.
donor for you. And then you go to half siblings, and your matches aren't going to be as great. And there's some of the clinical trials are around working with individuals that aren't as close of a match and finding ways to still make that acceptable to the recipient.
Okay.
So all those are challenges, right? In addition to that, the process that you have to go through as the recipient to prepare your body to take this foreign bone marrow is
Hmm.
pretty significant. It involves basically having chemotherapy and destroying much of your bone marrow, your own bone marrow.
Oh my goodness.
And
Okay.
so that's a very tough process for anybody. And then you can imagine a person with sickle cell disease, a person has a chronic condition anyway, and
Right.
then, exposing their body to that.
Yeah.
So it really is not, it's not ideal for everyone. For those that it works, it does work well. There are
Okay.
definitely people walking around who are cured of sickle cell disease because they had a successful bone marrow transplant.
Okay.
It's just that it's not an option for everyone. And I would be so far to say it's not an option for most.
Most. Hmm.
And it's a tough decision. I mean, there's a mortality rate, about a 10% mortality rate associated with bone marrow transplant. So you're kind of like, if I'm managing my sickle cell disease, okay, I don't know if I want to take that kind
With
of
a 10
risk,
chance. Yeah.
right? So, and it can be tough. I mean, some of the best candidates for bone marrow transplant might be children, and that can be a very hard decision. But you kind of want to catch them before their body gets too damaged by the disease.
Mm.
But you're talking to children who may have a very rough course of the disease anyway,
Right.
even in childhood. Um, so that's, so bone marrow transplant is what it is. When it works, it's great. I have seen it not work, and when it's not work, it's not pretty.
Yeah.
So yeah, so it's a definitely a long conversation and consideration around it.
Okay.
What's on the horizon, of course, is gene therapy. And
Okay.
so gene therapy is exciting because this means you actually take your own bone marrow, we
Hmm.
remove some of it, use gene therapy to go in and do a few different options. You can try to remove the sickle cell gene and replace it with the hemoglobin A gene. You can just try to disrupt that sickle cell gene and try to trick your body into making a different type of hemoglobin that you naturally have there. Just you don't usually make it. So there's different ways that gene therapy can potentially work. But obviously that's very, very new and we're still
Okay.
figuring that out. And those are in clinical trials as well.
Okay.
But sickle cell is a very ideal disease to explore something like gene therapy.
Okay.
And it's obviously it's something that if we can get it to work in sickle cell, it will help many other people with rare diseases, of which most are genetic, as well. But this brings us back to what is not unfortunately, but it's kind of unfortunately a common thread in sickle cell, where sickle cell really is used for developments in science in a way that doesn't always help the people in the community with sickle cell.
Yep.
So back when we first figured out the genetic cause for sickle cell disease, back in like 1950, a lot of developments came out of that knowledge of finding that gene, finding how to detect that gene, the mutation, the variation. It developed a lot of molecular genetics techniques that were
Mm.
based from just our knowledge of knowing the cause for sickle cell. But we knew about that for, 20, 30 years, 40 years, even 50 years before we actually saw a treatment for sickle cell come through.
Mhm.
Right.
Right.
So it's kind
Yep.
of like you get these developments kind of on the backs of people with sickle cell disease without them really seeing it. And so they're trying to change that narrative. I definitely, think with gene therapy.
Yeah.
Um, the challenge with both bone marrow transplant and gene therapy, though, is just access.
Yep.
Um, Individuals with sickle cell aren't even getting standard medical care, much less even being able to think about accessing something like gene therapy or
Yeah.
bone marrow transplant even.
So when we're talking about access, that probably
Mhm.
shows up in different forms. But are we talking about payers and reimbursement for
Mhm.
gene therapy? Is it that kind of access in terms of insurances, or is it just even getting to hospitals, places,
Yeah.
clinics that even know what to do with it?
Right. So we're not even going to get to like gene therapy and bone marrow transplant. We're just talking day-to-day management of sickle cell disease,
Yep.
even as it is now. And there are recommendations, around what, medications should be offered, around protocols of the standard of care for sickle cell. The problem is that there are very few hematologists who specialize in sickle cell disease. So
Mm-hmm.
hematologist, of course, is a blood doctor.
Mm-hmm.
And but often training in hematology is paired with oncology.
Mm-hmm.
So you have hematology, oncology, right? Residency programs that happen after medical school. And so the money is in oncology.
Oncology.
The money is not in sickle cell. And
Right.
so many times, residents decide to take that oncology route. Also, there's to even more to the point, there's very few training programs specifically for sickle cell disease in those residency programs. So, it's kind of like people are just kind of ushered into that oncology side and not so much into hematology.
Right.
So, sickle cell care in children is actually quite good. Most of your children's hospitals will have hematologists that, are able to manage sickle cell disease quite well. But, often once you get to 18, 19, 20, you kind of see this people fall off the cliff, literally, where their care is doing really, really well. And then they're just not able to find a provider who can take care of them as an adult. Um,
Mm.
and then they're faced with issues around systematic racism, institutionalized racism, that makes their pathway as an adult with sickle cell disease very hard and very rough.
Yeah.
And so people they get um, just frustrated with the medical system. They don't want to interact with the medical system. And so now they're just coming when they're having these acute episodes, which is really rough and hard time all the way around. It's hard for the providers. It's hard for them to, make it a positive experience. And so it just ends up being
Yeah.
just
No,
the
well,
way.
you've hit on so many important issues. This last one being a really critical one, because I've been having conversation with other folks, medical professionals, and others
Mhm.
around um, how do we, so as an example, how do we sort of push into genomics? And we know
Right.
historically we've had some challenges, right? We know the story of Henrietta Lacks. We know what happened with Tuskegee,
Yep.
and so I'm asking the question, like, so is that what those historical experiences, is that what precludes us? Is that what holds us back from really engaging the medical professional? I was talking to a friend of mine, a cardiologist, and he was like, Lisa, it's not those things. Like, most people
Hmm.
don't even know about those stories anymore.
Yep.
That's not what it is. It's the day to day. It's
Yep.
showing up and confronting the racism and just sort of the lack of real concern or real care, and thus the frustration around your particular condition and whether or not you're getting the treatment that you need. And that's a barrier. And that one's hard. That one's harder to hurdle, because that's person to
Yeah.
person.
It is, and it's hard to change those individual behaviors. And I wholeheartedly agree. I mean, I think there's a kind of a collective memory of those,
Yes.
those events that just over time have taught people as a whole in some communities just not to trust the medical system. Like, you've
Right.
never really been there for me before. Why are you suddenly here now?
Right.
Even discussions around gene therapy, individuals are like, I'm not your guinea pig. You need to go and figure
Right.
that out somewhere else. And when you figure that out, then
And you
come to
see, but you just said that in
yeah.
the challenge is that in a lot of the research and things that have taken place, there was kind of some guinea pig thing
Yes.
going on, right? That
Yes.
people we were making advancements around broader concepts used in other places on the
Yep.
backs of people who
Yep.
had sickle cell.
Yeah,
So
absolutely.
they're not wrong to
No,
say I'm not that, right? Or I
no,
refuse to be that.
no, not at all. Not at
Yeah,
all. And
yeah.
unless, you are able to show what is the benefit. And the thing about research is never really designed to benefit the person who's the participant in that research project. Like that's
Right,
one of the clear things you always need to get across when you're doing consent for research. Like this may not benefit you. I don't know if this is going to benefit you.
right.
Right. But I think that there is a way that you can at least approach research with the community that you're trying to do the research on or
Hmm.
in a way that at least attempts to answer the questions that they have,
Right,
right? To
right.
bring them to the table to see what are your issues. I'll give a perfect example. So years ago, when there was not years ago, probably like 6, 7 years ago, there was this conversation that the federal government, may have been the FDA, I can't really remember, but they kind of had this open house kind of thing with people with sickle cell disease.
Mhm.
And one thing that came out of that was that many people with sickle cell were saying how they just had such a problem sleeping.
Mm,
Like their sleep patterns were abnormal. People would blame it on their pain, but like it's really not my pain. And so that ended up being a topic that has opened up to a lot of research in sickle cell.
okay.
And, I think some people had thought about it before, but I think that forum really brought it up to the kind of bubbled it up to the top. So then now if you're going to do research on sleep and you have people in the community who want to know why am I not sleeping well, now they're going to be engaged in your research project,
Right.
right? Because you're answering a question that they even
That's
wanted to
meaningful
answer,
to them. Yeah.
right? And so I think if you do those types of engagements and and have those individuals there at the table when you're making that research project and helping them, one criticism of research in the past is something called umbrella research, where you kind of swoop in, you do this research, and then you swoop back out, and people in the community barely even know what the outcomes of the research was.
Right.
So we can't do that anymore, right? We need to and invest. Like the grantors need to understand research project may not happen in 2 years, it may take 5 years, because we need to make some inroads, we need to make some relationships
Right.
before we can just hop in and start thinking we're going to do this research and that it's going to be successful.
Yeah. No, well, you said something really important here, I think, and that is because part of the question that some of the conversations we've been having is how do you engage the community? So,
Hmm.
one of the things with genomics, we want to diversify that database.
Yeah.
We want
Yep.
to get everybody in there because that's really our only pathway to
Yep.
precision medicine. But
Yep.
then you ask the critical question, well, what's in it for me? Well, nothing today.
Yeah. Yeah.
Maybe. I mean, but the benefit over time for the entire community out
Hmm.
there, say the entire world, is significant, right?
Yes.
But maybe the pathway to engaging the community and diversifying those databases is answering questions that are germane and important to that community right now. So instead
Right.
of starting with the question that you want to answer yourself as a researcher, maybe you start with the question that the community is particularly suffering with. And
Yep.
that builds some goodwill, and that
Yes.
hopefully provides some answers. And then now you've created some relationships and partnership, and you continue to go on. Okay, now we're going to answer this question,
Yes.
not a question
Yes.
we had, but a question that we
Yes.
need broadly. But now I'm with you. Now I'm in.
Mhm. 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 And
And
I can I'll just make a perfect analogy then to sickle cell. So that thing that people with sickle cell want is care,
right,
right? They want that medical care in a place that they're respected, with providers who understand their disease. So we need to get back, because I alluded to the fact that we lost this funding for sickle cell. So these wonderful sickle cell centers that opened in the 70s, early 70s, all closed in 2008 because the federal funding stopped. So now the only way to place to get care is at hospitals who really have decided amongst for themselves to carve out a space to provide care for sickle cell. There's very little like federal funding or support for that. Yet, if we look at cystic fibrosis, hemophilia, are prime examples where there are comprehensive care centers for them funded by the federal government
right,
that, or partially, at least partially, um, to provide that care. And so if that was modeled in sickle cell, now you can address the main issue of care. Now I can start talking about, let's try this gene therapy. Let's try
Right.
this bone marrow transplant. But you
Right.
gotta meet people where they are and meet that need, which is what you, same thing, what you were saying.
Yeah.
You gotta
Yeah. No,
identify
I
that
was
need
saying
where
what
you
you were
are.
saying.
No, no, definitely. And you are, and as far as in that genomics world, absolutely. We need to diversify
Yeah.
this this our genetic, study pool.
Yeah.
And I think the route to that is, again, this community engaged research. I also very strongly think it's about training individuals to be scientists from those communities. You've
Yes.
got to engage communities in that way.
Yes. Yes.
Absolutely.
And that, I mean, that is paramount, because
Mhm.
again, like you said, the basis for so much of it is care.
Yes.
Right. And so you got to understand the community, you got to care
Mhm.
about the community, and you're showing up
Mhm.
in the community. And I know that you could have chosen to be somewhere. I know you could have chosen to be an oncologist and be over there, but you're
Right.
choosing to be a blood doctor, and you're
Right.
here. And
Right.
so that in and of itself says you care. So you're here.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
so that's, I mean, that's everything. Okay.
Mhm. Mhm.
So um can you, let's pull on the genomics card a little bit
Okay.
here. So
Okay.
how is genomics and this idea of precision medicine, like how is that playing in, let's say, the research that's happening and the progress that we're making, and or the potential for progress that we could make?
So, I mean, so definitely the major development in genomics and genetics is around this gene therapy space for sure. There's this CRISPR technology that you might have heard about. And so, CRISPR is a way that we can pretty much kind of cut genes in places where we want to and replace with the messaging that we want there, that will work better.
So
Um,
this would be,
mhm.
I'm gonna summarize before you move on, make sure I got
Yes.
it. So you would cut out the S gene and put in the A gene.
Yeah, or if not that whole gene, this the part of that gene
Part
that
of,
is kind of misspelled. Yeah.
okay,
Yep.
okay,
So
okay,
that would be one approach. The other approach, and I kind of mentioned before, there are other hemoglobin genes that you have that work well. So when you are a fetus, right, you make actually a different type of hemoglobin, a variant called hemoglobin F. Almost, everybody makes that. Everybody makes
mhm,
hemoglobin F. It's very special because when you are a fetus, you obviously can't breathe. So the only way you get oxygen is to grab it from mom's circulation. So this hemoglobin F has a what we call very strong affinity or attraction to oxygen. If it's anywhere, it will grab it. Now, once you're born and you can breathe for yourself, you don't have to have that kind of special hemoglobin anymore because you can get your own
mhm,
oxygen. So your body naturally stops making hemoglobin F. It's kind of a natural switch. And it
mhm.
starts making your hemoglobin A or hemoglobin S or whatever it is that you have the messaging for. We just found out that individuals with sickle cell disease that had a milder form of the disease, some of them were naturally still making hemoglobin F. And so that's kind of what started some excitement, like, okay, this might be an answer here. And hydroxyurea, which is one of the treatments for sickle cell, it was the first one that was approved by the FDA in the 90s. We found it kind of by accident, but one of the effects of this drug is that it causes an increase in hemoglobin F. So we said, well, let's try it in people with sickle cell. They did it, it worked. Not perfect for everybody, but again, for those that it works well. Um, so anyway, so this switching mechanism of this F turning off, that
Mhm.
is also a target for gene therapy
Okay.
because it's easier to disrupt a gene than it is to fix a gene.
Ah,
And so what we have done is we've identified a third gene that actually turns off that hemoglobin F. Like that's the job of
okay,
this gene. And
okay.
so if we can disrupt that, third gene, then
Ah,
hemoglobin F will go back to being expressed.
okay.
And so that person will naturally start just making more hemoglobin F, and that will alleviate the symptoms of the disease.
Wow. Okay.
So that's kind of where that gene therapy is going. So some gene therapy is focused on trying to correct that S
Yep.
gene, but then
Yep.
some of it is focused on trying to turn off or on some other genes that can cause other things to happen that would then make sickle cell better.
Oh my gosh.
So yeah, I mean, there's a lot of excitement around sickle cell. What we haven't figured out that well, and I don't know too much, I have to confess about the status of research around this, but you know, all of that hemoglobin S, again, is caused by this one specific variation in one letter of that DNA, right?
Hmm.
In this, what we call beta globin gene. Um, but it presents so differently in different people with sickle cell. You know, some people have more severe case, some people are more mild. Sometimes you can explain it, sometimes you can't. And so we haven't really figured out what those other, what we call modifiers are. What are modifiers of this? What other genes are involved that modify or affect how sickle cell is expressed? And so, so that's another area, you know, for possible
Hmm.
research. I'm sure someone's doing it to try to figure that out. Because you can't, you know, when you have a newborn with sickle cell, it's you can't tell the parents what their path is going to be. You know,
Uh,
it's just
you
it's
don't
just
know. Yeah.
yeah, it's
You
just
don't
so
know how it's going to present.
right, right. Some kids will have strokes at 2, and other kids go, you know, their whole childhood and do quite well. So it's very hard to predict.
Wow. Okay.
Mhm.
That's, I mean, so much to understand. I clearly I could go on with you a long time, but I know that I've taken more time than I should have. So
It's
here's what I always try to do with inputs to action.
yep,
So you have given us a ton of input. I mean, really have done a tremendous job of educating us now on sickle cell and what it means and why we need to be talking about it and
yep.
or exploring it, understanding it. What would you have us do? So what's
Hmm.
we take the input and now what's the action?
Right, right.
what would you have us go do?
So I'm gonna give you 2 tidbits,
Okay.
maybe 3, but 2.
All right.
So one is know your family history. Now, I'm trained as a genetic counselor. You know, I still see patients for things other than sickle cell. And so it includes, you know, cancer. I see pregnant patients. And so, you know, we know that family history is one of the more powerful tools that we have to know what to look out for in a person's health. And just like you shared in the beginning, think about you know, the importance of people knowing, you know, about sickle cell and who was presenting it and so forth. You know, knowing that you have a family history of sickle cell is important. You know, if you are interested in finding out whether or not there's a chance for you to have a child with sickle cell, knowing that family history may help to lead you to know what you should be tested for, you know, and so forth. And then again, on a more broader scale. So whether it's diabetes or breast cancer or heart disease, you know, we're learning a lot about how genetics affects our health. And we talk about personalized medicine, like
Hmm.
that family history is one of the first steps
Right.
for us to get some insight as to what we need to look out for. Um, and also that genes, but that being said, you know, genes are not the whole story,
Okay.
right? Genes give you that foundation, but then there's environment, there's diet, there's all
Mhm.
kinds of things on top of that. So, so your genetics is not your destiny per se.
Okay.
You
Okay.
know, in some diseases, yes, if you have those genes for sickle cell, you're going to have sickle cell disease.
Right.
But you know, there are many other types of health issues where genes can put you at a higher risk and so forth. But you know, you can use that information as power to help avoid or prevent certain conditions. So I think knowing your family history is important. Having those conversations with your potential mate, if this is something that's important to you. You know, as a genetic counselor, one of my main points is get the information for the things that you want to know about. No one should have to get tested if they don't want to. These
Mhm.
things are optional, right?
Right.
And that's what genetic counselors are for. They're there to help talk through those decisions with you, decide what do you want to know, what don't you want to know, you know, and so forth. Um, So that's one. And know and share your family history. I can't tell you how many people I talk to. Well, Aunt B never really talked about that cancer she had, or,
Right.
whatever. And I just don't know. And it would
Mhm.
be so much more powerful if we knew, right? So and so was sickly all the time. I don't know why. Maybe that person had sickle cell.
Right.
We don't know.
Right.
Um, and then as far as sickle cell specifically, give blood, give blood, give blood.
Ah.
So individuals with sickle cell disease, one of the treatment options for them is blood transfusion, and being on a blood transfusion program, coming in as soon as often as every 4 weeks to get transfusion as a way to maintain their health, where basically you remove that sickle cell blood from them and you're putting in blood that has hemoglobin A.
Oh.
And so there are limitations to our blood supply, right? You only have but so many people who are donating.
Mhm.
Talking a little bit about those genetic markers and things that make it easier for us to take in foreign tissue
Mhm.
blood,
Mhm.
right?
Mhm.
So if majority of the people who are giving blood are European with
Mhm.
certain genetic makeup,
Mhm.
then that person with sickle cell disease who may not be from that similar background may have a hard time receiving that blood from
Mm.
the general donor blood pool. So that's why it's so important to diversify our
Mhm.
blood. Now, I'm very quick to say there is not black blood, white
Mhm.
blood, Asian blood. No,
Mhm.
it's
Mhm.
not that simple.
Mhm.
Um, but we are, as we from whose descendants are more recently from the African continent
Right.
have much more genetic diversity to a way it will benefit everyone,
Right.
right? So anyway, so that's my message. If you can give blood, please do.
Okay. Okay.
Because people with sickle cell disease need it. Of course, we need it for many other things, for car accidents and other things as well. But
Right.
definitely our folks with sickle cell disease need it. And the Red Cross really has recognized this. They've have a lot of special efforts of going to HBCUs, working with our Black Greek organizations to
Mm.
really do a lot of blood drives and really increase the number of donors from diverse backgrounds.
Mm.
Um, and then the last thing I'll say is, if you love genetics, if you think you like genetics, go into the field. We need you. We need you. We need you.
Yes.
Genetic counselors, I can tell you from my field, only a little less than 2% of genetic counselors are African American. It's
Wow.
sad.
Yeah.
So please, if you have any interest, we need you in genetics.
Yes.
We need you to
Well,
go back.
and this is what you're saying is so key. We know this, and so much of it has to do with exposure. I always tell
Yes.
people
Yes.
the story. I had never heard of a genetic counselor until I was having a baby,
Mm-hmm.
and
Yeah.
and am getting the results from the testing
Right.
that was about to take place, or that had taken place. So it just nothing, no exposure.
Yeah.
Not that I'm one that you lost in the field, but I don't want you to think that I was the one that got away. I was not.
Right.
Uh, but I am acknowledging that, certainly there were some peers and others around me
Yeah.
that may have appreciated knowing and understanding that there's this whole field of
Yes.
genetics and
Yes.
ways in which to engage it that they
Yes.
were not aware of. So I love
Yes.
getting the message out to others about exploring genetics as a career.
Yeah.
Barbara, this has been fascinating
Yeah.
and just
This is
wonderful. Thank
great.
you, thank you,
No
thank you.
problem.
We've got more to talk about. I know. So we're gonna. This will not be. This. I'm gonna call this volume one. We're
Okay.
coming back. We're coming. We've got to talk some more. And
Yes.
maybe explore some of the things you were talking about in terms of research and where we're
Hmm.
going with that. Would love to
Hmm.
do that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Or family history or genetics in general. And yes,
Yeah,
I
yeah.
would love to.
More to come.
Love to.
Well, listen, I thank you, audience. Thank you. I
Thank
hope you have
you.
enjoyed this deep dive into sickle cell, and we just got such a great lesson. So I hope you have enjoyed that. And this brings us to the end of Inputs to Action. This episode featuring Barbara Harrison, assistant professor from Howard University, College of Medicine,
Yep,
lots of titles.
that's
I won't
fine.
even try to
Just
do them all. But
further than
you
that.
got you know that she did Howard. That's what you needed to know. That's what I wanted you to know. So I appreciate it again. Until next time, everybody, take care.
All right, goodbye. Thanks.